Good morning, welcome back. We did finish Ranger's Apprentice yesterday, but I'm going to read the first couple chapters of the next book to see if that's something you're interested in pursuing. Obviously, Will and Evelyn have been taken by the Scandians, so I think that pretty much sets up the problem and the plot focus for the next book. The next book is called The Ranger's Apprentice, Book 3, The Icebound Land. Chapter 1. The Wolf ship was only a few hours from Cape Shelter when the massive storm hit them. For 3 days, they had sailed north toward Scandia through a sea that was calm as a mill pond, a fact appreciated by Will and Evelyn. "This isn't too bad," Will said as the narrow ship cut smoothly through the waters. He had heard grim tales of people becoming violently sick on board ships at sea, but he could see nothing to worry about in this gentle rocking motion. Evelyn nodded, a little doubtfully. She was by no means an experienced sailor, but she had been to sea before. "If this is as bad as it gets," she said. She had noticed the worried looks that Eric, the ship's captain, was casting to the north and the way he was urging Wolfwind's rowers on to a greater speed. For his part, Eric knew that this deceptively calm weather heralded a change for the worse, much worse. Dimly, on the northern horizon, he could see the dark storm line forming. He knew that if they couldn't round Cape Shelter and get into the lee of the landmass in time, they would take the full force of the storm. For several minutes he assessed speeds and distances, judging their progress against that of the onrushing clouds. "We're not going to make it," he said finally to Svengal. His second-in-command nodded agreement. "Looks that way," Svengal said philosophically. Eric was glancing keenly around the ship, making sure that there was no loose gear that needed to be secured. His eye lit on the two prisoners, huddled in the bow. "Better tie those two to the mast," he said, "and we'll rig the sweep steering oar as well." Will and Evelyn watched Svengal as he made his way toward them. He had a coil of light hemp in his hand. "What now?" Will asked. "They can't think we're going to try to escape." But Svengal had stopped by the mast and was beckoning urgently to them. The two Arielans rose and moved uncertainly toward him. Will noticed that the ship's motion was becoming a little more pronounced and the wind was increasing. He staggered as he made his way to Svengal. Behind him, he heard Evelyn mutter an unladylike swear word as she stumbled and barked her shin on a bollard. Svengal drew his sax knife and cut 2 lengths of cord from the coil. "Tie yourselves to the mast," he told them. "We're in for the mother of all storms any minute." "You mean we could be blown overboard?" Evelyn asked incredulously. Svengal noted that Will was tying himself to the mast with a neatly executed bowline knot. The girl was having some trouble, so Svengal took the rope, passed it around her waist, and then secured her as well. "Maybe," he replied to her question. "More likely washed overboard by the waves." He saw the boy's face go pale with fear. "You're telling us that the waves actually come on board?" Will said. Svengal darted a fierce, humorless grin at him. "Oh, yes, indeed," he said, and hurried back to assist Eric in the stern, where the captain was already rigging the massive sweep oar. Will swallowed several times. He had assumed that a ship like this would ride over the waves like a gull. Now he was told that the waves were likely to come crashing on board. He wondered how they could possibly stay afloat if that were to happen. "Oh, what is that?" Evelyn said softly, pointing to the north. The thin, dark line that Eric had seen was now a roiling black mass, only a quarter of a kilometer away, sweeping down on them faster than a horse could gallop. The two of them huddled close to the base of the mast, trying to wrap their arms all way around the rough pine pole, scrabbling for a grip with their fingernails. Then the sun was blotted out as the storm hit them. The sheer force of the wind took Will's breath away. Literally. This wasn't a wind like any Will had ever known. This was a savage, living, primeval force that wrapped around him, deafening him, blinding him, punching the breath out of his lungs and preventing his taking another, smothering him as it tried to claw his grip loose. His eyes were shut tight as he struggled to breathe, holding desperately to the mast. Dimly, he heard Evelyn scream and felt her begin to slip away from him. He grabbed blindly at her, caught her hand, and dragged her back. The first massive wave struck, and the wolf ship's bow canted up at a terrifying angle. They began to rise up the face of the wave. Then the ship faltered and began to slide, backward and downward. Svengal and Eric screamed at the rowers. Their voices were plucked away by the wind, but the crew, their backs to the storm, could see and understand their body language. They heaved on the oars, bending the oak shafts with their efforts, and the backward slide slowly eased. The ship began to claw its way up the face of the wave, rising higher and higher, moving more and more slowly until Will was sure they must begin the terrible backward sliding motion again. Then the crest of the wave broke and thundered over them. Tons of water crashed onto the wolf ship, driving it down, rolling it far over to the right until it seemed that it would never recover. Will screamed in absolute animal terror, then had the scream cut off as freezing salt water hammered against him, breaking his grip on the mast, filling his mouth and lungs, and hurling him along the deck until the fragile cord brought him to a stop, swirling this way and that until the mass of water passed over and around him. He was left flapping on the deck like a fish as the ship righted itself. Evelyn was beside him, and together they scrambled back to the mast, clinging on with renewed desperation. Then the bow pitched forward, and they were plummeting down the back of the wave into the trough, leaving their stomachs far behind, and screaming with sheer terror once more. The bow sliced into the trough of the wave, splitting the sea and hurling it high above them. Once again, water cascaded over the deck of the ship, but this time it lacked the full force of the breaking wave, and the two young people managed to hold on. The water, waist deep, surged past them. Then the slender wolf ship seemed to shake itself free of the massive weight. In the rowing benches, the relief crew had already started at work, bailing water over the side with buckets. Eric and Svengal, in the most exposed part of the ship, were also tied in place, either side of the storm sweep. This was a massive steering oar, half as big again as one of the normal oars. It was used instead of the smaller steering board at times like these. The long oar gave the helmsman greater purchase so he could assist the rowers in dragging the head of the ship around. Today, it took the strength of both men to manage it. Deep in the trough between waves, the wind seemed to have lost some of its force. Will dashed the salt from his eyes, coughed, and vomited seawater onto the deck. He met Evelyn's terrified gaze. Weakly, he felt he should do something to reassure her. But there was nothing he could do or say. He couldn't believe that the ship could withstand another wave like that. Yet, another was already on the way. Even bigger than the first, it marched toward them across several hundred meters of the trough, rearing and massing itself high above them, higher than the walls of Castle Redmont. Will buried his face against the mast, felt Evelyn doing the same as the ship began that awful, slow rise again. Up and up they went, clawing at the face of the wave, the men heaving until their hearts might burst as they tried to drag Wolfwind up the wave against the combined force of wind and sea. This time, before the wave broke, he opened his eyes in horror as she began to surge backward to certain disaster. Then the crest curled over and smashed down upon them, and again he was sent spinning and scrabbling on the deck, fetching up against the rope that secured him, feeling something slam painfully into his mouth and realizing that it was Evelyn's elbow. Water thundered over him, then the bow pitched down once more, and Wolfen began another sliding, careening dive down from the far side, rolling upright, shedding the seawater like a duck. This time, Will was too weak to scream. He moaned softly and crawled back to the mast. He looked at Evelyn and shook his head. There was no way they could survive this, he thought. He could see the same fear in her eyes. In the stern, Eric and Svengal braced themselves as Wolfwind slammed into the trough, sending sheets of water high either side of the bow, the whole fabric of the ship vibrating to the impact. She rolled, shook, righted herself again. "She's taking it well," Svengal shouted. Eric nodded grimly. Terrifying as it might seem to Will and Evelyn, the wolf ship was designed to cope with massive seas like this. But even a wolf ship had its limitations. And if they reached them, Eric knew they would all be dead. "That last one nearly had us," he replied. It was only a last-minute surge by the rowers that had dragged the ship through the crest as she had been about to slide backward into the trough. "We're going to have to turn her and run from before the storm," he concluded, and Svengal nodded agreement, staring ahead through eyes slitted against the wind and the salt spray. "After this one," he said. The next wave was a little smaller than the one that they had nearly finished them, but smaller was a relative term. The two Scandians tightened their grip on the sweep oar. "Heave!" Eric roared as the rowers at the mountain of water reared high above them, and Wolfwind began another slow, precarious climb. "Oh, no, please, please, let it end," Will moaned as he felt the bow cant upward once more. The terror was physically exhausting. He just wanted it to stop. If necessary, he thought, let the ship go under. Let it all go. Make an end to it. Just make this mind-numbing terror stop. He could hear Evelyn beside him, sobbing with fear. He placed an arm around her, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything more to comfort her. Up, up, and up they went. Then there was the familiar roar of the collapsing crest and the thunder of water crashing down upon them. Then the bow came through the crest, slamming against the back of the wave and plummeting down. Will tried to scream, but his throat was raw and his energy exhausted. He managed only a low sob. Wolfwind sliced into the sea at the base of the wave again. Eric bellowed instructions to the rowers. They would have a short time in the wind shadow of the next approaching wave, and that was the time to make their turn. To the steerboard side, he bellowed, pointing his hand to the direction of the turn just in case his voice didn't carry to some of the forward rowers, although there was little fear of that. The rowers set their feet against the wooden bracing boards. Those on the steerboard or right-hand side of the ship drew their oar handles back toward them. The left-hand side rowers pushed theirs forward. As the ship leveled, Eric roared out his order. Now! The oar blades dipped into the sea, and as one side pushed and the other pulled, Eric and Svengal threw their weight on the sweep. The long, narrow ship pivoted neatly, almost in one spot, bringing the stern around to the wind and sea. Now pull together, Eric roared, and the oarsmen went to it with a will. He had to keep the ship moving a little faster than the following sea, or it would overwhelm them. He glanced once at two young airline captives, huddled miserably by the mast, and then forgot about them as he went back to judging the ship's movements, keeping her stern to the following sea. Any error on his part, and she'd broach sideways, and that would be the end of them. They were riding easier, he knew, but this was no time to be distracted. To Will and Evelyn, the ship was still plunging and rearing in a terrifying fashion, traveling through a vertical distance of as much as 15 meters as she went from crest to trough. That's like 45 feet up and down. That's how big the waves are. But now the movement was more controlled. They were going with the sea, not fighting it. Will sensed a slight easing in the motion. Spray and solid water still slammed over them at regular intervals, but the terrifying backsliding motion was a thing of the past. As the ship coped with each successive mountain of water sweeping under and around it, Will began to believe that they might have a slight chance of survival. But it was a slim might. He still felt the same surge of bowel-gripping terror with every wave that overtook them. Each time he felt that this could be the last. He put both arms around Evelyn, felt her arms go around his neck in return, her icy cheek pressed against his own. And so the two young people sought and found comfort and courage from each other. Evelyn was whimpering with fear, and so was he, Will realized with some surprise, muttering meaningless words over and over, calling out to halt, to tug, to anyone who might listen and help. But as the wave followed wave and Wolfwind survived, the blinding terror lessened and nervous exhaustion took its place, and eventually he slept. For 7 more days, the ship was driven far to the south, out of the narrow sea and into the fringes of the endless ocean, and Will and Evelyn huddled by the mast, sodden, exhausted, freezing. The numbing fear of disaster was always present in their minds, but gradually they began to believe that they might survive. On the 8th day, the sun broke through. It was weak and watery, to be sure, but it was the sun. The violent plunging motion ceased, and once again the ship rode smoothly across the face of the rollers. Eric, his beard and hair trimmed with salt, hauled tiredly on the sweep, bringing the ship around in a smooth curve to face north once more. "Let's head for Cape Shelter," he told his crew. So that's chapter 1. I'll read chapter 2, but that was a hurricane, I'm thinking, right? Big, big hurricane, except I didn't... usually there's a pause or a calm in the middle, the eye of the storm, so they must have been on the outside. Chapter 2. Holt stood motionless against the massive trunk of the oak tree as the bandits swarmed out of the forest to surround the carriage. He was in full view, but nobody saw him. In part, this was due to the fact that the robbers were totally intent on their prey, a wealthy merchant and his wife. For their part, they were equally distracted, staring with horror at the armed men who now surrounded their carriage in the clearing. But, in the main, it was due to the camouflage cloak that Holt wore, its cowl pulled up over his head to leave his face in shadow, and the fact that he stood absolutely stock still. Like all rangers, Holt knew that the secret of merging into the background lay with the ability to remain unmoving, even when people seemed to be looking straight at him. "Believe you are unseen," went the ranger saying, "and it will be so." A burly figure, clad entirely in black, now emerged from the trees and approached the carriage. Holt's eyes narrowed for a second, and then he sighed silently. Another wild goose chase, he thought. The figure bore a slight resemblance to Foldar, the man Holt had been pursuing since the end of the war with Morgorath. Foldar had been Morgorath's senior lieutenant. He had managed to escape capture when his leader died and his army's subhuman wargles faded away. But Foldar was no mindless beast. He was a thinking, planning human being, and a totally warped and evil one. The son of a noble Arielon family, he had murdered both his parents after an argument over a horse. He was barely a teenager at the time, and he had escaped by fleeing into the mountains of Rain and Night, where Morgorath recognized a kindred spirit and enlisted him. Now he was the sole surviving member of Morgorath's band, and King Duncan had made his capture and imprisonment a number one priority for the kingdom's armed forces. The problem was, Foldar impersonators were springing up everywhere, usually in the form of everyday bandits like this one. They used the man's name and savage reputation to strike fear into their victims, making it easier to rob them. And as each one sprang up, Holt and his colleagues had to waste time tracking them down. He felt a slow burning of anger at the time he was wasting on these minor nuisances. Holt had other matters to attend to. He had a promise to keep, and fools like this were preventing him from doing so. The fake Foldar had stopped by the carriage now. The black cloak with his high collar was somewhat similar to the one Foldar wore. But Foldar was a dandy, and his cloak was immaculate black velvet and satin, whereas this was simple wool, badly dyed and patched in several places, with a collar of cruelly tanned black leather. The man's bonnet was unkempt and badly creased as well, while the black swan's feather that adorned it was bent in the middle, probably where some careless bandit had sat on it. Now the man spoke, and his attempt to imitate Foldar's lisping, sarcastic tones was spoiled by his thick rural accent and clumsy grammar. "Step down from the carriage, good sir and madam," he said, sweeping a clumsy bow. "Fear not, good lady, the noble Foldar ne'er harms one as fair as thee art." He attempted a sardonic, evil laugh. It came out more as a thin cackle. The good lady was anything but fair. She was middle-aged, overweight, and plain in the extreme. But that was no reason why she should be subjected to this sort of terror, Holt thought grimly. She held back, whimpering with fear at the sight of the black figure before her. Foldar took a pace forward, his voice harsher, his tone more threatening. "Get down, missus," he shouted, "or I'll hand you your husband's ears." His right hand dropped to the hilt of a long dagger in his belt. The woman cried out and cowered farther back into the carriage. Her husband, equally terrified and more than fond of his ears where they were, was trying to push her toward the carriage door. Enough, Holt thought. Satisfied that no one was looking in his direction, he nocked an arrow, drew, and sighted in one economical motion, and released. Foldar, real name Rupert Gubblestone, had a brief impression of something flashing past just in front of his nose. Then there was an almighty jerk on the raised collar of his cloak, and he found himself pinned against the carriage by a quivering black arrow that thudded into the wood. He gave a startled yelp, lost his balance, and stumbled, saved from falling by his cloak, which now began to choke him where it fastened around his neck. As the other bandits turned to see where the arrow had come from, Holt stepped away from the tree. Yet, to the startled robbers, it seemed as if he had stepped out of the massive oak. "King's Ranger," Holt called. "Drop your weapons." There were 10 men, all armed. Not a single one thought to disobey the order. Knives, swords, and cudgels clattered to the ground. They had just seen a first-hand example of Ranger's black magic. The grim figure had stepped clean out of the living trunk of an oak tree. Even now, the strange cloak that he wore seemed to shimmer uncertainly against the background, making it difficult to focus on him. And if sorcery weren't enough to compel them, they could see a more practical reason. The massive longbow with another black-shafted arrow already on the string. "On the ground, belly down, all of you!" The words cut at them like a whip, and they dropped to the ground. Holt pointed to one, a dirty-faced youth who couldn't have been more than 15. "Not you," he said, and the boy hesitated on his hands and knees. "You take their belts and tie their hands behind them." The terrified boy nodded several times, then moved toward the first of his prone comrades. He stopped as Holt gave him a further warning. "Tie them tight," he said. "If I find one loose knot, I'll—" He hesitated for a second while he framed a suitable threat, and then continued. "I'll seal you up inside that oak tree over there." That should do it, he thought. He was aware of the effect that his unexplained appearance from the tree had on these uneducated country folk. It was a device he had used many times before. Now he saw the boy's face whiten with fear under the dirt and knew the threat was effective. He turned his attention to Gobblestone, who was plucking feebly at the thong securing his cloak as it continued to choke him. He was already red in the face, his eyes bulging. They bulged farther as Halt unsheathed his heavy sax knife. "Oh, relax," said Halt irritably. He slashed quickly through the cord, and Gobblestone, suddenly released, fell awkwardly to the ground. He seemed content to stay there out of the reach of the gleaming knife. Halt glanced up at the occupants of the carriage. The relief on their faces was all too obvious. "I think you can be on your way if you like," he said pleasantly. "These idiots won't bother you any further." The merchant, remembering guiltily how he had tried to shove his wife out of the carriage, tried to cover his discomfort by blustering. "Oh, they deserve hanging, Ranger, hanging, I say. They have terrified my poor wife and threatened my very person." Halt eyed the man impassively until the outburst was finished. "Worse than that," he said quietly. "They wasted my time." "The answer is no, Halt," said Crowley, "just as it was the last time you asked." He could see the anger in every line of Halt's body as his old friend stood before him. Crowley hated what he had to do, but orders were orders, and as the Ranger Commandant, it was his job to enforce them, and Halt, like all Rangers, was bound to obey them. "You don't need me," Halt burst out. "I'm wasting time hunting these imitation Foldars all over the kingdom when I should be going after Will." "The king has made Foldar our #1 priority," Crowley reminded him. "Sooner or later we'll find the real one." Halt made a dismissive gesture. "And you have 49 other rangers to do the job," he said. "For God's sakes, that should be enough." "King Duncan wants the other 49, and he wants you. He trusts you and depends on you. You're the best we have." "I've done my share," Halt replied quietly, and Crowley knew how much it hurt the other man to say these words. He also knew that his best reply would be silence. Silence that would force Halt further into the sort of rationalization that Crowley knew he hated. "The kingdom owes that boy," Halt said, with a little more certainty in his tone. "The boy is a ranger," Crowley said coldly. "An apprentice," Halt corrected him, and now Crowley stood, knocking his chair over with the violence of his movement. "A ranger apprentice assumes the same duties as a ranger. We always have, Halt. For every ranger, the rule is the same. Kingdom first. That's our oath. You took it, I took it, and so did Will." There was an angry silence between the two men, made all the uglier by the years that they had lived as friends and comrades. Halt, Crowley realized, was possibly his closest friend in the world. He reached behind him and straightened the fallen chair, and then made a gesture of peace to Halt. "Look," he said in a milder tone, "just help me clear up this Foldar business. 2 months, maybe 3, then you can go after Will with my blessing." Halt's grizzled head was already shaking before he finished. "In 2 months he could be dead, or sold as a slave and lost forever. I need to go now while the trail is still warm. I promised him," he added after a pause, his voice thick with misery. "No," said Crowley with a note of finality. Hearing it, Halt squared his shoulders. "Then I'll see the king," he said. Crowley looked down at his desk. "The king won't see you," he said flatly. He looked up and saw the surprise and betrayal in Halt's eyes. "He won't see me? He refuses me?" For over 20 years, Halt had been one of the king's closest confidants, with constant, unquestioned access to the royal chambers. "He knows what you'll ask, Halt. He doesn't want to refuse you, so he refuses to see you." Now the surprise and betrayal were gone from Halt's eyes. In their place was anger, bitter anger. "Then I'll just have to change his mind," he said quietly. And that's that. So I guess, if you're interested, I'm kind of interested in reading it, too, by myself, but my copies are at school. So anyways, look for something. I don't know if I'll have you vote or I'll just choose one, but I'm thinking I'm going to choose one that I've already read last year that's already videotaped. So starting, what is tomorrow? Thursday? Starting Friday, we'll start a new book. So, all right. Have a good day. We'll see you in a little bit.